So super inspired by our keynote, just with the thought with Neil, I decided that I will frame everything around complexity. And if it starts working, no, it's not. I should explain, there's a lot of going on my screen, and because I don't control the screen, it's quite interesting to think how it's working.
Maybe just ask for the slide.
Yeah, can we just move on one slide? It would be, if not. Anyway, I think because always discussing technical stuff, we will face some technical issue. I will start with super short two elements, but I think, and I still believe it's most important way and part to think about AI and value change and everything around. So first, it's about complexity. We will focus on hardware and compute, but we should understand the interconnection between data infrastructure, human capital, and policy, even if we are focusing on compute and hardware. And second, I just want to challenge you all. So for the whole day today and tomorrow, think and reflect. We are so super focused on the competition in terms of development, and we're almost ignoring deployment. But from practical standpoint of politics, implementation and deployment, this is a key element what's going on in the AI field, and the country who can achieve it with the proper institutional foundation will lead in everything, because development is just not enough. But I will focus today on presenting you a big picture. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, I can. Yes, lovely. So the block scheme what you saw here, this is a kind of lifespan or way of thinking about life cycle of semiconductor industry, because usually when we're talking about hardware, it's about semiconductor and chip manufacture. And if you pay attention, there would be three main super intriguing points. So number one, if you combine the whole cycle all together, you will find out that somewhere around 90% of manufacture leaded and grounded and based in what we call Western like-minded democracies. And it's a quite interesting question. Why we are so worried about supply chain when 90% of manufacture process controlled by our friends, alias neighbors? The second point here, it's about raw material. And obviously, because predominant raw material for semiconductor chips controlled by China, it's just a big question how we will build what is called sovereignty in a technological AI world. And also because somewhere around 50% of the element of manufacturing based in Taiwan, it's another super intriguing idea about Asian Pacific region and influence on the Western, our understanding of semiconductor manufacturing. And lastly, it's about concentration. So there is an unbelievable great company in Netherlands that controls manufacture production for the whole Europe and for the whole Western countries. And in the semiconductor field, there is the same issue that in AI in general, where we're thinking about Meta, Amazon, Google, etc. So these 3 points lead to another quite interesting idea. I still try to figure out how the input like working here. Another interesting bit is how everything evolved around compute. So if it's in a hardware development, we clearly understand that there is a complexity in a way of country's representation and also in a way of company representation. Then in a way of compute, one of the unbelievable idea is that we clearly understand that the growth in models in compute, there is no limits. So there are particular limits in the way how we understand resources. There are particular limits in the supply chain. There are particular limits in the way of deployment AI, but in the way of compute, we cannot find any limits. And it leads us to the kind of paradox from geopolitical perspective, where we have this concentration complexity, we have supply chain vulnerabilities, we have concern from national security of each of the actors in the state. We clearly express and understand the protectionist policy that lead to increasing fragmentation, and it's lead to war situation in a way how international cooperation work. And it's lead us to the idea of AI Cold War or a idea of AI arm race, where on the one hand, hardware and compute, this is the source for AI development and AI implementation. On the other hand, the competition over AI lead and disturb the hardware and compute. And this is where I want to present our, I don't know why, our vision and our understanding that if we are focusing on a universal understanding of AI or any regulation, it will lead to bigger confrontation, competition. But if we are focusing on a specific domains, what we call domains, you can think about sectors, you can think about fields, where, for example, we already have agreement between at least 4 international organizations on, for example, cybersecurity or health or education or agriculture. It's provide additional source to understand how we can cope with the supply chain vulnerabilities and how we can develop the better hardware and compute production in the future in the way of current complexity. And if you take a look on industrial policy perspective, because usually from the perspective of industrial policy, this is where we think about hardware compute. It's less about AI regulation from an ethical perspective or value-based perspective. It's more about, can we build something along infrastructure and data? You can find out that all of the countries listed there and much more, they compete over leadership, but in the same time, they regulate the similar fields. So for example, all of the countries focus on data-focused approach because data is important, because data is a field for everything what we are doing with AI. All of these countries thinking about how we can build capacity building, and how we can provide data sets platforms. All of the countries think about how to attract investments, and at the same time, how to maintain the sovereignty and security. This led to the ambition kind of view or idea to challenge current competition field to think about, can we build something as a model for international cooperation, similarly as European Union do, can I? Yes. Similarly as European Union do in a way of how they attract investments and work in international research areas. And all of this lead us to, I honestly skip only once. Yes, no. Input lab, yes, thank you. And all of this lead us to the several points of or ideas to think about hardware and compute. So first, when we try to balance technical scope about manufacture of chips and political idea of how we will regulate stuff, and also human capital, how we will support people to do stuff, we kind of should find a balance between securing current environment on our sovereignty and at the same time not prevent collaboration, but boost collaboration. We also should think about trust that Neil also mentioned in keynote. And we also should think about how open software can provide additional coping mechanism to secure our current manufacture development. And the idea of kill switches that currently super popular because of what new United States government tried to do controlling the technology. And also to push forward from this quite boring speech about hardware and compute. First is that we talk a lot about regulatory sandboxes, innovative hubs without any understanding how to deploy them. My favorite idea here, 2016, European Union published a AI militarization report where it was, we will be first who will build regulatory sandbox. 9 years left. So currently 2025, we don't have nothing. So just the idea of regulatory sandboxes, and we should kind of push forward to build them and test them. And second, if you think about concrete implementation from the current existing institutional foundation on Asia-Pacific region, Western countries, et cetera, it will provide opportunity to create multi-stakeholder engagement. Yes, thank you. It was super fast.
just amazing. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of the panelists today and all of you who are experts in lots of areas that I'm very curious about, including industrial policy. So today I will talk about mapping the global inequalities of AI compute and some potential implications for compute sovereignty. My talk will draw from some research co-authored with Professor Vili Leiden-Verta at the University of Oxford and also Aalto, and Zoe Hawkins, who is Director of Text Policy Design Institute in Australia. And the paper, in case you're interested, is called Compute North versus Compute South, the uneven possibilities of compute-based AI governance around the globe. And this was published in the 2024 AI Ethics and Society conference proceedings. So from a social sciences perspective, it's possible that I might be leaving you all with more open questions rather than answers, but that'll be interesting to explore. Next slide, please. So I'll talk for about 10 minutes, and I'll start with a quick overview of compute in the broader AI stack, followed by the paper's background and methodology. I'll end with the paper's findings and some potential questions to inform policy implications of a global compute divide. So I won't spend too much on this, but as most of us know, the AI stack comprises of data, labor, and compute infrastructure layers, which we can think of as the core inputs to AI. Data and models have been a very visible layer of the stack in terms of policy focus over the last 2 years. And this layer is also enabled by a huge amount of human labor required to make data useful for AI development, from AI data workers to model developers and broader organizational staff. Underpinning all of this is a layer that we're most interested in today, which is compute infrastructure. This includes software for data and model development or accessing compute infrastructure, and the hardware required to power this, including AI chips, data centers, and broader networking infrastructure. This hardware is in turn reliant on domestic energy, water, and land resources to operate, although I won't talk too much about this today. Next slide, please. So today I will focus on compute through the lens of AI chips and those that are designed and sold by the US company NVIDIA, specifically the NVIDIA A100, H100, and V100 chips. So this is an NVIDIA A100, which is a graphic processing unit, or GPU, which specializes in AI workloads, and it's enabled many of the recent advances in large-scale deep learning. These GPUs are critical for AI development, which is reflected in their price. A chip can cost anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 USD per chip. And with companies like OpenAI and Meta building 100,000 chip clusters, you can imagine the amount of upfront capital investment required. These chips are primarily distributed to developers and enterprises through hyperscale cloud providers, which is a very concentrated market. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that today. There are 3 US companies, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, comprising roughly 70% of the global cloud market, with Chinese companies Alibaba, Huawei, and Tencent being a large portion of the remaining 30%. And since 2022 and the release of OpenAI's ChatGPT, we see this resource being used to gain political leverage by governments through trends towards AI nationalism and industrial policies that aim to shape domestic and international chip markets, with the US CHIP Act being, I guess, a prime and prominent example of this. However, the efficacy of these levers are mediated by an intensely concentrated chip supply chain. Next slide, please. Thank you. I won't talk too much about this because I think Aleksei covered the kind of complexity of this supply chain better. But NVIDIA is a very prominent GPU design and marketing firm, which is US-based and designs 80 to 90% of all AI relevant chips, so those most relevant for advanced frontier models. NVIDIA in turn relies on 2 companies to produce the chips which they design and sell. So the Dutch company ASML, which was mentioned, and the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, which currently produces 90% of the global chip supply. NVIDIA then sells these chips to hyperscale cloud providers, who are essentially the gatekeepers of compute access, with the 3 US providers alone making up roughly 2/3 of this market, and we'll return to this importance shortly. Next slide, please. With this context in mind, our research started with, these are actually not the correct slides, but could you go to the slide that shows the background? The next slide. Sorry, I might have excluded this one to fit into the 10-minute time limit. So the slide before was just a bit of a primer on AI data centers. which is a focus of my research from a technical perspective. So if anyone wants to talk more about what's entailed in their development and hyperscale ownership of that, I'm happy to speak to that as well. But the background of the paper starts with this observation that the chip supply chain is very concentrated in terms of both geography and ownership. So we draw from existing work on compute governance and the political economy of the AI supply chain to understand the geographic distribution of AI compute and use this as a tool to provide data for further decision making. In doing so, we distinguish between private and public compute, which is interesting from a measurement methodology perspective, because private compute clusters are those that are owned by for-profit companies for in-house use. So for example, Google will use a private compute cluster to train Gemini before releasing models for public use, versus public compute, on the other hand, is rented out on demand to developers and companies via hyperscale platforms. So it's public, not in the sense that it's publicly funded, but in the sense that it's shared with other providers. And in our research, we focus on public cloud because it shapes AI diffusion throughout society. It's a primary way that small and medium enterprises, large enterprises will access compute, and also because it's measurable from a publicly available data perspective. And although research has looked at divides between academic and private sector compute access, the political geographic divide of AI compute has not been addressed. So in the paper, we have a very simple research question, which is where in the world is public cloud AI located? Thank you. I'll just talk briefly on the methodology so we can get to the findings, but in order to map public AI compute, we have 3 levels analysis. So we conducted a census of public cloud providers' cloud regions, focusing on the 6 major US and Chinese hyperscale cloud providers. In doing so, we focus on the most AI relevant chips, so those that have really driven recent advances in large-scale deep learning, the H100, A100, and V100. We also mapped the H800s and A800s, but as these were created specifically for the Chinese market to subvert US export controls, which is a separate interesting conversation, we didn't really find evidence of these, and so they're not mapped. And then finally, we produced some maps to help analyze the geographic distribution of cloud regions where you can access AI relevant compute, and interviewed policy and compute experts to understand some of the shaping factors behind this geography. Thank you. So this slide just shows, I guess, account of some of the data that we included. I think I won't go too much into it, but the paper is publicly available, and I'm happy to kind of bore you with these details afterwards. Perfect. This map shows the high-level results of our AI compute mapping based on the census from 2023. You can see the AI-relevant GPUs based on H100s and A100s and V100s in North America, Europe, and China, with scattered availability of the less powerful V100 chips in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Asia-Pacific region. That's probably quite overwhelming, and also the map is quite scattered, but I guess the TLDR of relevance is that H100s and A100s are AI development chips. So they're the most powerful chips required for fundamental research and development, so training, evaluating, and fine-tuning models, and have been directly used in a lot of the recent advancements. Whereas V100s on the other side, although they can be used for AI training, in our interviews and also from my own experience working in AI, we understand that these chips are not necessarily the ones that you would choose if you want to be a kind of leading AI company. So we associate these chips more with inference, so the process of deploying a model, for example, generating a model response to a chatbot query. So this, I guess if you look at the clusters, basically what it shows is that the most powerful AI development chips are located in Europe, North America, and some wealthier, smaller countries like Australia, versus AI deployment chips, so less powerful chips, are more scattered around countries that we might typically associate with the global south. Next slide, please. And just quickly on limitations, cloud regions don't capture scale and quantity. So just to say that the study is very limited based on publicly available data, but it kind of gives a direction of these global concentrations of power that are relevant to policy. And penultimate slide. So to break down the map before in a more simple way, our analysis suggests that there is a global compute divide reflecting an emerging landscape of compute haves and have-nots. We conceptualize a north-south compute divide to suggest where power through infrastructure may be concentrated across the globe. We refer to this as the compute north, which is shown in blue, the compute south, which is shown in red, and the desert, which is shown in beige. The compute north captures countries that have the most powerful GPUs relevant to developing AI, so countries that have that cultural and economic power to create a model that could be deployed via cloud, for example, through an API. The compute south refers to countries that have GPUs most suited to AI inference or deployment, or perhaps training a smaller open source model. And this is largely across countries we associate with the so-called global south. At the compute desert, by all intensive purposes of how we categorize AI public compute, do not have access to the most powerful NVIDIA chips. And as our mapping shows, these compute infrastructures are not evenly distributed across the globe and potentially also entrench existing economic and political inequalities. And I'm a little bit over, but I'll just quickly touch on the final slide, if that's okay. So what are the implications of a global compute divide, and why do we care about who owns and controls AI compute? In our paper, we discussed some of these political economic drivers, but I'll just flag a few interesting aspects here. So the first is weaponized interdependence, which suggests that countries that control key hubs of digital infrastructure can shape them to their advantage. And this is demonstrated by the US government's use of industrial policy through the CHIPS Act to shape Chinese and other actors' access to NVIDIA chips. This strain of research also questions the growing political power of corporations, which is something I'm very interested in. Separately, there's a lot of research on big tech lobbying in terms of benefiting from national AI resource programs, and you can see this in the UK as well, with industrial policies often benefiting big tech corporations. And secondly, foreign and corporate ownership troubles the goal of digital sovereignty, which is something that I'm also hoping to do more research on. So for countries that are compute poor, dependencies on foreign infrastructure have a compounding impact across the whole stack. The phenomena of cloud lock-in means that once a country aligns with a certain provider, say Google Cloud for general cloud computing storage, the scale economies and energy efficiencies mean that they are incentivized to be locked into the broader cloud ecosystem, both through accessing their AI models and also through purchasing compute. And this further entrenches reliance on US cloud and chips. And even though we might not think that these geographies are, say, problematic for a middle power like the UK, there is a competition question, I think, in terms of the amount of lock-in and vertical integration across the supply chain. And I think to end, if computational power equals to an extent political power, then the AI boom and accompanying infrastructure investments seem poised to entrench existing global inequalities and compute divides.
Thank you. So I'm now going to zoom in on the semiconductor value chain, which is only part of the AI value chain, as Aleksei showed. So I tried to be not to be too technical and give you an overview of the value chain in 10 minutes, trying to emphasize some insights from our OECD analysis and some bottlenecks in this value chain. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the semiconductors are key to a wide range of sectors, of course, AI systems, but they also enable many other applications in our digital world. To give you an example, there are 6 manufacturing industries where semiconductors are as important as primary energy as an input into production. And this includes sectors such as machinery or motor vehicles. So I'm going to zoom in on semiconductor, but I'm also going to zoom out and look at different applications than just AI. Thank you. So we care about semiconductors because of their many applications, but we also care about semiconductors because this is a very complex value chain. I'm glad that this infographics here corresponds to what Aleksei showed already. It's perfectly compatible. Let me go into some of the detail of this chart. So a typical chip is goes through, I would say, three distinct steps for production. Chip design, wafer fabrication, also called front-end manufacturing, and assembly, test, and packaging, also called back-end manufacturing. And each of these steps depend on a range of different suppliers, of technologies, of inputs, and equipment. So a typical chip might be designed, let's say, in the United States, with intellectual property coming from the United Kingdom and software designed in the United States. The design can be then sent to a contract manufacturer, a foundry, let's say in Chinese Taipei, and this foundry will rely on equipment from the Netherlands, Germany, Japan. Will require raw materials from a bunch of different countries. And once the semiconductor, the integrated circuit is etched on the wafer will be sent to a third location to be packaged. So for instance, here on this graph in Malaysia, where the packaging step will also require different types of equipment and different types of raw materials. But this is a simplification of the value chain for two reasons. First, it can be organized in different settings. Companies can be integrated vertically and process and manufacture and control the three processing steps, but it can be also the case that three different companies control the three different steps. On top of that, there are many different types of chips, and in fact, there are as many supply chains as types of chips. So this would add another dimension of complexity to this graph. Next slide, please. So because of the pervasiveness of semiconductors and because of their complexity, there has always been a lot of policy interest for semiconductors. But recently, over the last, let's say, 5 years, this policy interest has further grown for several reasons. First, because market concentration has reached a very high level in some segments, and also because the supply chain has experienced significant disruptions in 2021 and 2022. This has led to efforts by many governments throughout the world to either nearshore parts of the supply chain or even encourage the emergence of a domestic ecosystem through a broad range of policies, which can be grouped into under the industrial policy theme. Next slide, please. So clearly, given this context, this is having resilient semiconductor supply chain, at least among like-minded countries, is close to a global public good. And that's where the OECD comes in, trying to increase the resilience of this supply chain by improving the understanding of the semiconductor ecosystem through more evidence and data exchange, but also by enabling policy dialogue and international cooperation on the supply chain. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this presentation is to give you some, present some insights from 3 OECD pieces that are displayed on this slide, and they all try to map dependencies and bottlenecks in the supply chain. So the first paper on which this presentation will rely is an overview of the semiconductor value chain at a high level based on trade data. And what we argue in this paper is that even with the most granular data available, this is not sufficient to precisely identify dependencies and bottlenecks. So we need more granular analysis zooming in on different segments of the supply chain. And that's what we're doing in the next two papers. First, a chips taxonomy, which develops a common language for countries and institutions to categorize chips and gather data based on this common language. And finally, the third piece is an application of this taxonomy where we assembled a new data set to measure capacity data on wafer production, so the central step of the value chain I showed in one of my previous slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the main result from our first paper using trade data. We show that dependencies in the semiconductor supply chain are on the rise. So we consider that for a given product and for a given country, there is a dependency if the market share of the largest provider at the country level is high, and if the concentration in the global market is also high, which means that you cannot credibly find alternative supplies. So the left graph shows the mapping of these dependencies across economies, so mapping the dependencies of OECD economies to non-OECD economies. And what we see is, first, that the number of dependencies has grown very significantly over the last 10 years, and that this growth is largely driven by dependencies to China. The right graph shows the same information, but across segments rather than across economies. And what we see is that this growth of dependencies was driven by two categories, chips themselves and photosensitive semiconductor devices. We also see that upstream in the supply chain, dependencies remain very high for raw materials. But we argue that this picture underestimates dependencies in the supply chain. So here, even though we use the most disaggregated trade data available at the global level, this is still too aggregated. I'll just give two examples of why this is the case. Think about chips, for instance. In these chips, we have different goods. At the finest level of classification, we are able to identify processors. But this processor category includes microprocessors, CPUs, but also the GPUs and the chips that Boxi showed in her presentation. This graph tells you nothing about dependencies for these AI chips. Even worse than that, this data groups different steps of the supply chain. So for instance, you are not able to distinguish packaged from unpackaged chips, which means that you might have a high concentration in one of the steps of the supply chain. You won't be able to identify this here because different steps will be pulled together. Next slide. So that's why we need to assemble our own data to identify bottlenecks at a more granular level. That's what we've done based on commercial data and also based on information from our network of policymakers in OECD and non-OECD economies. So this graph shows data on wafer production capacity, again, the central step of the value chain, for different types of chips. And this is the most aggregated level of our chips taxonomy. So the dark shade shows installed capacity, and the lighter shade shows planned or under construction capacity. So let me focus on the top right graph showing advanced logic chips. So that's where you're going to find the AI chips, the GPUs, TPUs that are used to power AI systems. And there are mainly two messages from this graph. First, that the production capacity is concentrated in two countries, Chinese Taipei and the United States. And also that the recent wave of policies or industrial policies supporting the building of new capacities does not increase diversification, does not contribute to diversification in the supply chain. Quite the contrary, capacities will be even more concentrated in the two leading countries. Next slide, please. So I just want to conclude by sharing a few research and policy priorities based on what I've shown. So first, starting with the research priorities, there are three priorities that I listed on this slide. So for the time being, we've focused our attention on identifying the bottlenecks in the wafer fabrication segment, because this is the one concentrating the most attention from policymakers. But there are also important bottlenecks potentially in other parts of the supply chain. So just to name a few, back-end manufacturing shows also some concentration, but also equipment, I think was shown by other presenters, the case of ASML, for instance, and raw materials, also very important. Another priority is that the data I showed are focusing on supply. But we cannot take as granted, given the important business support that we are seeing in the supply chain, that supply is only driven by market forces. So in that situation, we might see supply-demand mismatches or overcapacities appearing in some segments and potentially undercapacities in other segments. So that's important to also map demand and ensure that they match. And finally, what's also very important in the current context, I already mentioned the importance of business support in the supply chain, is to monitor policies and their impact to ensure that these policies deliver and have a decent value for money. Last, about policy priorities, I've cited two of these policies here, but I'm happy to elaborate during the discussion. I think one area that is underexplored in terms of policies is the area of skills, because we are facing a global shortage of talents, of what the so-called STEM talents more generally, but also of semiconductor talents. And this heavily affects the effectiveness of policies, and is also an area where coordination among like-minded countries can yield positive sum gains. And finally, if we want to achieve diversification and resilience in the supply chain, we need to support some countries in developing their own ecosystem. And that's another work stream we are starting and we have developed. And I'll stop here with shameless self-promotion to give you a link to a paper we recently published to provide a paper providing policy recommendations for the development of the ecosystem in the Philippines. And I stop there. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt from the Lovelace Institute. Thanks, everyone, for being here today and for the Bennett Institute for inviting me to speak. So I'm here from the Ada Lovelace Institute. We're a policy-focused research organisation based in London and in Brussels. And we have the mission to make data and AI work for people and society. We're fully independent, both of industry and of government, which I think makes us pretty unique in this space. So I'll be presenting today on our Computing Commons report, which we published back in February, and I co-authored with Sai Vipra, who's a brilliant socio-technical researcher based at Cornell University in the US. As we've already heard today, in contemporary AI, access to compute determines pretty much everything, not only the pace of research progress and who can participate in the sector, but also where investment is directed and what that research centers on. And there's this growing compute divide that we've heard about from multiple presenters. So state provision in this area, state provision of computing resource, isn't a new thing. It dates back as early as the post-war period. But the growing prominence of compute in this context and the emergence of these arms race dynamics between companies and also different states across the world have seen public compute initiatives proliferate. So with our project, we wanted to map these initiatives globally, develop a taxonomy for understanding them, and set out some recommendations for their future development. So as part of this, we spoke to about 30 policymakers and experts through interviews and roundtables with a focus on 5 jurisdictions: China, the EU, India, the US, and the UK. And you'll note that they're all in the compute north that we heard about in Boxi's presentation. Just a bit on definitions. So I think it's important to underscore that we define public compute in a particular way, and it's not the same as public AI compute, to use Boxi's term. So we were looking primarily at the funding side. So we define public compute quite broadly and ecumenically as initiatives that use government funds to provide particular groups with access to compute resources. And that could be access to hardware, it could be direct provision of GPUs, it could be the full stack, so providing compute as a service. But we take quite a broad view of compute as well. So thinking about not just the hardware, but also the software and enabling infrastructure that might be necessary. I should also emphasize at this point that we weren't looking kind of further down or rather upstream in the supply chain at the semiconductor production or kind of industrial policy measures at that side. We're primarily looking at the provision of compute by the public sector. So if you go on to the next slide. So yeah, we were looking at public compute initiatives as they exist today, and we found a landscape that was pretty complex, characterized by pluralism, by experimentalism, and that there's not really yet a single approach or set of best practices. And that's fine. There probably isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, partly because they're all pursuing different objectives. So traditional research computing infrastructure from government tends to have focused on supporting academic research and large-scale scientific modeling. Newer initiatives often have broader ambitions around AI development and innovation, particularly around national competitiveness, and also sometimes about improving the diversity of research or quote unquote democratizing access to AI. And some of those objectives can be in tension as well, which we'll come on to a bit. And as might be obvious as well, approaches tend to be shaped by existing industrial strengths and weaknesses, national policymaking traditions, and international factors such as export controls. So it's not surprising that countries with a longer history of doing this might have more interventionist approaches to public compute, whereas some jurisdictions such as India default towards voucher schemes. If we could move on, thanks. And I think this illustrates some of those different objectives. So this is a very simplified version of a table that's in the report. So please take a look at that if you want more. But we can see all these different, this kind of pluralism in action here. So we think about the US National AI Research Resource, or the NARE, which is currently in pilot, that aims to democratize access to AI by providing users with the compute, skills, and other resources they need to carry out AI research. Whereas India's initiatives focus more on building technological capabilities in strategic sectors and supporting the development of domestic supply chains. So there's some variance there. And they also take a variety of different forms. So some, as I've mentioned, provide GPUs directly, others provide vouchers for accessing private cloud services, such as in India, and many, particularly in the global north, provide direct access to public supercomputing projects operated by government or state-funded entities. So the EU and UK are good examples of this. And some, like the US NARE, which I've already mentioned, provide a combination. So often jurisdictions are doing a mix of these things. So if we could move on to the next slide. Thank you. I think the other thing to say, these are kind of some of the initial questions we had to break down these initiatives. And I think the other thing to say about the what and the how is that media coverage of these initiatives often focuses on massive investments and massive scale compute installations. But actually, something we found in our research is most researchers and startups primarily want or need access to smaller clusters of GPUs for development work rather than massive parallel computing capability. But on the flip side, they tend to require better support infrastructure, software environments, and skills development. So there are different user needs depending on who you're targeting. And then the how it's provided also varies considerably across jurisdictions. So we see this as a bit of a spectrum. So if we could go to the next slide, this runs right through from direct public provision. I mentioned the UK AI research resource. There are other examples of this in China, through arm's length and public-private partnerships, right through to private provision with funding. So where private entities are providing resources with public money, and then again to those direct subsidies or voucher schemes that I mentioned, where the state is providing financial support for organizations to access compute from existing providers. And this has lower overheads in terms of it's easier to set up and administer, but it also provides fewer affordances in terms of introducing conditionalities and placing kind of requirements on users. So some of the ones kind of further towards the direct public provision side of the spectrum, for example, might introduce safe development requirements for users, safety requirements, requirements around open publication of research, or restrictions on commercialization. Obviously, it's more difficult to do that if you're providing vouchers directly. And I think the final thing to mention in terms of, if we could go back actually for now, thanks. In terms of the taxonomy that we were kind of working with, is these schemes vary dramatically in terms of the overall offering. So I mentioned that often these initiatives are conceived holistically. They're not just providing raw compute, but they're actually intended as comprehensive programs to build capacity, communities, and infrastructure for their users. And that's true of some of them, whereas some of them are offering a much more kind of compute-only service. So if you go to the next slide. So far, this is a really messy picture. So we wanted to identify a simpler typology to kind of classify the different initiatives we're seeing. And we identified 4 broad families of public compute initiative. So these were direct provision in the generalist sense. So these are the large-scale general purpose infrastructures that are aimed at servicing different use cases from academic research right through to public sector projects that might have particular security needs. And they tend to use quite flexible architecture. And this typically involves large capital investment in facilities housed within national laboratories or research institutions such as universities. And then we're also seeing more recently these more AI-focused initiatives that are also directly provided by the state or arm's length entities. And these are infrastructures that are specifically designed for computationally intensive AI workloads. So think about frontier, quote unquote, LLM development, and areas of research such as multimodal and multi-agent systems. And these initiatives tend to be GPU-centric and optimized for AI workloads and have more flexible access patterns and might have specific support services for AI-focused users. And then the 2 other models of provision we identified were firstly decentralized provision. So this is when the state uses public resources to facilitate networks of smaller facilities that are distributed across regions. Open cloud compute in India is a good example of this. And there are also examples in China as well. And these facilities can themselves be publicly or privately owned. And then last but not least, market provision was our term for the sort of voucher schemes that I've already mentioned. So this is when public funds are used to provide financial incentives, vouchers or subsidies to help users access compute from existing commercial providers. So basically the public cloud providers we've heard about today. So I'll just finish by talking about some common challenges, because as I've emphasized, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this or getting public compute provision right. And different jurisdictions have adopted dramatically different strategies based on their existing capabilities, policy frameworks, and strategic objectives. But there are some of these common challenges and tensions to navigate around value capture, around ensuring strategic coherence when you have all these different initiatives often jostling together in the same jurisdiction, ensuring flexibility over the long term, while also ensuring you have the stability that is necessary for big public investments, and around meeting climate and environmental obligations. And we did find some promising avenues towards mitigating these risks. I won't talk at length about them now, but there's more info in the report. So a good example is work that some jurisdictions are carrying out exploring the introduction of more stringent conditions on users. So that includes, as I've mentioned, open publication of research findings. It also includes things like public stakes in subsequent commercial vehicles for research. Others are thinking about how to use procurement strategically. So moving beyond simple cost considerations to thinking about how public compute initiatives can support emerging players and more sustainable approaches in the long term. So, for example, by dedicating a portion of their capacity to testing and validating new hardware solutions from smaller firms. Above all, though, and I'll finish on this note, I think we'd stress that public compute initiatives alone cannot, despite the lofty rhetoric around initiatives such as Lalanne, they're not going to democratize AI. When they're not going to comprehensively address the fundamental market dynamics, some of which we've heard about today, that have led to dramatic concentration across the AI stack. So we think it's really important that in addition to pursuing these initiatives in the right way, governments pursue parallel regulatory interventions to promote competition and prevent further entrenchment of dominant positions. And that could include, we think, things like common carrier measures and also robust antitrust enforcement as well. So we say a lot more about this in the report, but I'm going to leave it there for now. Please do take a look if you get the chance, and hopefully we can get into some of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
So could I invite the panelists to come back and sit under your name, which I'm bound to get wrong, but let's give it a go. So that was fascinating, and I'm just struck by the contrast between the complexity that Alex showed us on one of his first slides and the way that the policy debate focuses on just some slices of that really complex hardware bit of the supply chain. Now, my instructions say we should have a discussion among the panel first, and I have lots of questions, and then go to the audience. But I think I'm going to, having already messed up alphabetical order, do the reverse. And so start by asking who in the audience would have questions. Philip is ready to lob the microphone at anybody who wants to ask a question. Steve.
Thanks. There've been a few references to the level of concentration in different parts of the supply chain. Matt, you ended on this. I'm struck that seems to be fairly normal in technology markets. As I said earlier, my background's in telecoms, where we have 3 operators, 2 equipment suppliers, and 2 mobile phone operating systems. I guess my question and we've made various attempts to change that and failed. I guess my question in the context of AI is whether we're stuck with that degree of concentration or whether there's something that can actually be done.
Who'd like to give that a go? Maybe Yuki.
Yes. So I think there are some valid parallels with the market for telecommunications, but there are also some differences. If you recall the 2021 episodes, for instance, where we had major disruptions in supply chains, this was driven by, to some extent, physical events, natural disasters, and concentration in manufacturing industries make us vulnerable to this kind of disruptions. That's important. I think that's a major distinction between telecommunications and manufacturing in general. This is true for semiconductors. This might be true also for data centers or for other physical infrastructure.
Yes, go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, in many sectors where there is a natural monopoly, telecoms is one good example, but there are other sectors that fall into that category, such as energy and water. Many countries actually don't take. They recognise that if there is a market, it's going to be consolidated. So they actually take a different and kind of public utility approach. So I think that would be a very valid path to go down in the case of cloud provision, for example. I think the broader problem with AI that makes it different to telecoms, for example, is the way in which that market power is then leveraged downstream at the application layer. So if you look at the way that the hyperscalers that dominate not only cloud, but different layers of the AI stack, including model development, if you look at the way they're aggressively selling technology into particularly the public sector in the UK, US, and elsewhere, and the way in which they're defining use cases that, as we've heard about, people don't necessarily want, and kind of, you know, aggressively pursuing this model of kind of winning market share and then kind of locking that in. I think that poses challenges in a way that kind of more single-use technologies don't.
Neil.
So thanks for the presentations. And I mean, a lot of the focus was on compute, which is clearly important. But one of the things I'm curious about, and comes back to this sort of the time constant question that came up earlier. I've been in lots of computer science departments across my career, and at least 3 of those buildings I've been in were supposed to be heated by the computers in those buildings. And by the time I arrived in those buildings, the nature of compute had transformed so dramatically that wasn't working anymore. So the Manchester building I was in was built in the 1970s and had this idea of an enormous central computer in the middle. The building I'm in today had the idea of everyone has a desktop that's going to heat their rooms. So I've sat very cold in my rooms for a number of years. And it's always struck me, and I think this is somehow that compute is interesting because it's an infrastructure that changes on time horizons that are a little bit beyond those that are clearly obvious and near, but are actually much shorter than the significant time horizons over which we really care about legal transformations. So I'm a little concerned the over focus on, I mean, it's clearly important and there's clearly a shortage. Bennett and Minderoo did a recent report on this. But in the long term, it feels like data is perhaps the more robust area to legislate on. But I was curious what people on the panel thought about that balance. And maybe it's just how cold I am in my office that makes me think about this.
Alex wants to have a go.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to point out completely bizarre situation in our policy. If you open up policy documents and you will try to find something regarding compute, you'll find zero information. The policy narrative completely ignoring part of the compute. They focus on infrastructure, data, and regulation. Sometime about human capital, that's all. So compute, it's more like a pushback from the academic community and industry to say, oh, this is important focus, what you should do. This is first. Second, in terms of time, from the policy perspective, the issue that we tend to think in a priority and strategy to support something, right? So any government want to know how to mobilize resources for some specific element to be super specific, clear in this area, etc. And this is why we tend to be focused on the idea that, oh, compute important right now for some specific supercomputer, we will develop it, but without any long-term perspective, how and why we want to do this. From this perspective, data is not more important, but more valuable proxy to regulate something. But the issue with data is that when we regulate data, it's about personal information, trust building, institutional memory, institutional foundation. But when you regulate compute, it's slightly easier because it's pure technology, right? And infrastructure plus technology, that's all. So it's just easier way to do stuff. And this is why, because our countries, Western democracies, think about election cycles, we tend to think 5 years, we deliver something around compute, and next government will think about something else. And if you compare with China approach, they don't care about 5 years. They think about 50 years, 100 years. This is where they more focus and tend to think about this. And if I may, super short about concentration. Concentration is not good, not bad. But my point would be, we can, for some reason, we do not learn from our mistakes and from future in terms of concentration. And my favorite example would be Netherlands. So Netherlands in semiconductor possess unbelievable amount skill, knowledge, and practical outcome. And even after COVID-19, if you take a look on European Union debates, they're not visible for some reason, friends in Germany visible who do not produce nothing in semiconductor industry, literally zero. So I think in terms of concentration, it's more important to think on the example of best practices, what we currently possess, and build on it, rather than thinking about big economies, benefits, and politics around this concentration.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in from online, and a couple of them, Boxi, are directed at your talk more. So I'm going to combine two of them. One is about whether a market-led approach or a government interventionist approach would be the best way to address the kind of inequality, the global inequalities that you talked about. And I'm going to link to that, how should the global community think about preventing the market leaders from abusing the dominant position that they have with regard to developing or lower income economies? How should the global community prevent the abuse of that market power?
Thank you. I struggle to write some things down. In terms of market-led or government approach, I am not an economist, so I sort of fear for my life a little bit in giving my opinions, but I think it really depends, I suppose, what perspective you're thinking from. If we're thinking from the perspective of a middle power like the UK that isn't feasibly able to onshore, for example, the chip production supply chain, then your options really are something like building a local alternative option and trying to figure out how to tackle issues of scale and efficiency by not using a cloud provider, aligning with a foreign provider, and then regulating data and models, or ensuring that, when they build a data center, for example, there's some sort of public value capture in that, or these emerging paradigms of collaboration and, creating trustworthiness and autonomy through those sorts of collaborations. So I guess broadly that's a government-led approach, but I think it depends which context you're speaking from. And does anyone else want to add on that before I move to the issue of global community collaboration?
No, I think go ahead.
I won't say too much on this because there's a number of scholars who work very intensely on this. So Sumaya Nur with the Oxford Martin School, Zai Vipra as well, who are thinking about, for example, South-South collaborations on compute. But I think one of the main concerns when it comes, one of the main concerns with respect to compute benefit sharing, for example, so this notion of global North or Chinese or US compute being deployed rapidly in what we might call third countries, is that some of the emerging paradigms of compute governance, which involve things like knowing your customer or on-chip hardware mechanisms, the ability to remotely shut down compute usage due to a certain list of bad activities, they really decrease a sense of autonomy for actors that don't align with the providers of that computational resource. So I don't have answers, but I think there's something about balancing autonomy with the broader resilience of AI development.
I have a follow-up question for you and Alex, actually. So Alex, you started by saying countries should be looking for leadership positions in deployment, not development. And on your map, Boxi, the orange chips that are more focused on deployment and inference, so I think Japan showed up, but also Indonesia showed up, which I thought was quite interesting. So would you agree with Alex's point, and how would you think about those countries' position?
Thinking more about deployment in terms of capturing economic and social value through deployment of AI applications rather than the kind of underlying infrastructure. Yeah, that was a question for you. So yes, I'm guessing yes, that was. Maybe you could expand on what you meant by focusing on deployment. Is it about capturing deployment economic benefits or about enabling infrastructure for deployment?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of our academic tendency to think about AI and what we are doing in our research, but at the same time, it's also pure practical issue. So, for example, two examples. So if you take a look on Malaysia and Vietnam, right? Both countries do not possess advanced technological development. So what they're going to do in such geopolitical environment, and they do very smart stuff, they try to build system of human capital and also how they deploy already existing technology while they working on attractive investments and develop something. So the practical way of thinking about Asia Pacific region, for example, it's not about pushing, because no one can compete with the amount of infrastructure and financial resources in US, in China, right? It's a way of thinking. We already possess some amount of technology. We already possess institutional memory of transformation in our public service. So can we deploy technology, building a practical outcome of it? And from this perspective, I think one of the examples would be Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Asian Pacific region. Another example would be my favorite Nordic Scandinavian countries, right? Where they, on the one hand, possess technological advanced development elements, but in the same time, they think about social values and how they develop and deploy stuff on the ground.
Thank you for expanding. I won't take up too much time on that, but I think from the position that I am in academia, I guess I never want to think that we should just focus on one part of the AI stack. I think that every part of the AI stack is intrinsically linked with all the others, and you can really see that in cloud infrastructure because, for example, a country kind of focusing on data center investments, that inevitably enables local reliance on those cloud systems, accessing those models, deploying models through those software systems. In terms of countries that don't have more powerful chips or who aren't able to prioritize that sort of fundamental development side of things, I guess from a deployment perspective, you could argue quite simplistically that they're very reliant on data and AI models that are produced by wherever AI data and models are concentrated. So essentially, it's third-party algorithms that you access through AWS, Google, Amazon, or in the case of Southeast Asia, it's a lot of these emerging Chinese and also open source models. So I think there is something about considering the implications of using a model that's not designed for that local area. So I suppose from a deployment perspective, you could think about broader AI safeguarding and how to fine-tune those models downstream, so not the kind of fundamental development, to make sure that they suit local use cases. And then I think the only other thing I'd flag around inferencing compute is that because NVIDIA is so dominant in training compute and the in-house, all the hyperscale cloud providers are creating their own in-house chips. The market for alternative chip providers is just really, really difficult to enter. But I have read some discussions around how inferencing chips could be an opportunity. So deployment relevant chips could be an opportunity for these third countries that don't have that kind of transformational training technology because the software entry requirements are lower. So you can see that with Grok and Cerebras, who are US companies, but that's another potential avenue for countries that don't have training compute to try and address those concentration issues.
Super short, just to challenge everyone. Just want to point out in terms of NVIDIA, etc. DeepSeek example open up unbelievable cool idea. And to be honest, I'm quite a pro market here and pro competition. DeepSeek, it's one of the example when without access, legal access to the chip market, you can deliver a model that can compete with the top level models, right? That means that some regions possess some opportunity to do stuff even without infrastructure, proper infrastructure on the chip manufacture. Yes.
We'll come back to it if we've got time. We'll come back to the DeepSeek issue. I've got one more from online, which is more for Guy and Matt, I think, which is, haven't industrial policies in the US and EU largely failed?
Yeah, so as an economist, I think the answer to this question is probably perhaps too early to tell. And I would say to really assess the effectiveness of these industrial policies, we would need to understand what were the objectives in the first place and how we can quantify these objectives. If the objective is not only in jobs or in technology, but also in terms of economic security, then I'm not sure I'm able to really evaluate these policies. But that being said, I think yes, there has been some major setbacks in these policies. And I think this is for two main reasons. First, because they underestimated the ecosystem nature of manufacturing and chips manufacturing on the one hand. And I think relatedly because they focused on business support rather than trying to come up with an integrated industrial strategy, trying to address the different aspects of the challenge, of the industrial challenge. And when it comes to chips, for instance, it takes many different ingredients to produce a chip. You need, of course, to have the capital, but you also need, I mentioned that in my intervention, you need to have the skills, and this is much more complicated and cannot be built from one day to the next. But you also need cheap and affordable energy, if possible, renewable. You need also a lot of water, a lot of different types of infrastructure. Logistics is also very important, and some of these aspects have been neglected in the policies.
Matt, you gave us this very nice typology of different types of provision. Do you think any of them work better than others?
Good question. I wouldn't say necessarily that any of them. Well, as I said, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think certainly there are different affordances with different ones. So if you have a more decentralized approach or a market-based approach, you're less able to kind of pull certain levers. So I mentioned kind of access requirements, licensing, and so on. If I could make a more general point around the industrial policy question, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to comment on kind of whether these levers are likely to create jobs or kind of raise productivity. But I do think, at Ada, we're about making data and AI work for people in society. And I do think there's a really important public interest question here, where usually in the development of other industries, there is a loose tethering of the development of technologies to the market, to the public interest via market mechanisms, right? We don't have that in the case of AI or compute, right? These are highly speculative use cases that are then used to justify massive investments from companies that aren't yet turning a profit on any of these products. So there's not yet that kind of clear connection between people using things and then the investment that's being plowed into them that we have in other sectors. So there's a case there for what have traditionally been called industrial policy or industrial strategy levers to be used to bring in some of that tethering to the public interest and bring in some of that accountability that we just don't have because this is quite a historically unique economic situation.
Thank you. Let's go back to the room. Paul in the back.
Issue of dual use. So one of the reasons there's lots of export controls on these chips is that they've got dual use potential. So not only can they be used to train AI models and do fantastic stuff for society, but there's also a risk that they'll be used to develop military technology and specifically to get around the nuclear test ban treaty. So one of the reasons there are controls in is we don't want certain nations to access that. And all of those nations have signed up to international law banning the development of these weapons and non-proliferation. If you were to go to the State Department, they may say, the solution we've got here is a very good solution. It's a very simple, elegant solution. What we do is we prevent access to chips, which prevents people doing bad stuff with them. But we provide access through commercial entities to the use of compute to do good stuff. And that kind of solves the problem. Now, we can kind of nuance so my question is that actually quite a simple, elegant solution that does work? There's a kind of a second question to that is, that may have been true 100 days ago. It may be less true today, and is there a nuance there? So my question is, from a dual use perspective, is the problem that you're identifying actually quite a nice solution?
I may. So I will use one example, right? And in my mind, it's always, we have a high quality, high tech stuff that is cheap. And we use a policy instrument literally like 200 a year when we develop. So we literally harm the chip by the export control. And why? Because in current Russia-Ukraine war, they use the chips from dishwashers. So the idea of export control is cheap. in a way how it's currently framed and how it currently doesn't work, it just doesn't make any sense. So for export control in a high-tech stuff like AI, chip, cloud computing, etc., we should develop new policy instruments, and we should develop a new institutional foundation about control of this export control. And I'm sorry for the control, but the idea is that, oh, we limited China to buy our chips. In reality, they buy it through the India, that's all. So it's create additional buffer zone for different companies that made unbelievable amount of money, but the policy outcome almost negative. So to answer on the question, no, it's not a proper way to do stuff. It's the same like, oh, let's regulate internet when we know that VPN exists. Yeah, cool idea. Nice done. Let's do this. In reality, if we want to do something about chip manufacturing, chip control in a way how we understand it in military and security, we should start with the drones and currently how it's shape our battlefield and warfare. And build on this, we should think how we can create a proper network of islands, well, a proper network of the countries who will build institutional foundation to control how those chips distributed. And do we have any level of trust over the globe to build it? I think this is a more dramatic question to do stuff around chip control. Because currently, in case of Russia, North Korea, China, it just zero impact. Honestly, but it's no, I mean, it still exists there. Once again, DeepSeek is a great example, a lot of different examples in a lot of different countries. So it's better to start to think, can we deploy new policy instruments to this element?
Anybody else want to come in on this one? No, thanks, Alex. So one in the middle here. Thank you, and then we'll come back. Yes, don't throw that microphone.
Hi, I'm Tessel from Ethic AI as well. This is not so much a question, but just to kind of leap into the discussion here. Not to play devil's advocate here, but part of why we also don't see the results of the export controls is because part of the export controls is also that it's more like a long-term vision. So, for example, there were many contracts that were already signed that are signed years before. And that those were, for example, in the case of ASML, they were still allowed to, for example, provide certain machines. So that's why with certain parts of the export controls, we don't see the results yet. Now, I agree with what you're saying, where we have to kind of find a way or find a system with the countries that are involved in the value chain of semiconductors, for example. Okay, what are the countries that we agree with? What are the terms that we agree our chip distribution on, and from there build it further. But I think there's different reasons for why the export controls are, of course, there. But I think that part of the export controls are also that it signals that certain countries are not in part of that same value system of other countries, for example, in the value chain. So it's a harsh way of setting it up now, and it's something we still need to think about, but I think it's kind of like signaling part of it.
Thank you for the comment. So the question at the back there, Rosalie, if you could pass that back, thank you.
Hi, Martian, also with Ethic AI. Just developing on the nuclear mentioned earlier. In recent months, we've heard reports of big tech companies investing in nuclear power, kind of agenda setting, greater development of that to extend AI capabilities. So relating this to the question of research and policy making around compute, what does the privileging of nuclear power to some actors mean for solidarity and alignment around AI policy making?
I think you need to unpack your question a bit more. Is that a question specifically about energy usage? Vicky, you mentioned energy.
Thank you. No, perhaps I wanted also to comment on what has been said before about the export controls. Start with this, to say that I'm not sure the objective is to completely prevent access to these chips, but also to just to increase the cost of access and delay access. So moving to civilian uses now, just to say also that in any case, the semiconductor value chain and the AI value chain anyway cannot be controlled by a single country or a single region. So this means that trade will remain necessary, and we need to work on how to ensure that chips, compute power, and data can still flow freely between like-minded countries to ensure efficiency in the supply chain. Then about energy, yes. So this is a key input into not only chip production but also chip use. And this is one of the main challenge chip producers are trying to address. So there is the famous Moore law. They are trying to increase the computing power of chips at an exponential speed. But now there is a second challenge that is coming, which is to ensure that at the same time that we increase processing power, we do not increase with the same speed the energy needs of chips. And this is a real challenge for the industry. And that's the reason why I think they are investing in the upstream segment, trying to secure energy needs, because even though they are working on the energy intensity of their chips, they also need to ensure that they will have a secure supply of energy going forward.
So we've only got a few minutes left before lunch, so I'm going to ask each of you to answer a question. If you think about this complex supply chain in the hardware part of the stack that we've been talking about, what would your recommendation be to governments about where to put their financial resource or their policy attention? How would it change from the policy debate that we're having today? So we'll start. We'll go in the same order, Alex.
Yeah. So I completely agree with everything that my panelists will tell you. I just want to point out, and I want to have a small disclaimer. I do not receive any money, so if Paragraph will call me. But there is a company in Cambridge called Paragraph. I would recommend to Google them. And they a full stock semiconductor manufacturer based in Cambridge without any connection with China raw materials, and unique that they bought US company to build PI, to build proof of concept, and create a company here in UK, because usually it's vice versa. You buy technology here and develop it in US. So my recommendation would be, please pay attention to local development, support local development, analyze it, treat it as a best practices, ask, can we scale up this experience of Cambridge to any other part? If not, what we should do in Northeast and Northwest to develop such clusters. Because a lot of European countries, in UK specifically, possess unbelievable potential, unbelievable small companies who deliver stuff, but completely ignored because of the big companies like Microsoft. Similar would be with LLMs. There are unbelievable amount of small local LLMs built and developed in Cambridge and Oxford, completely ignored by local government, completely ignored by state, because we're all in a big friend with big companies, which is great, love them, but still, advice would be take a look on your local companies and develop and build on this.
Think local, I like it. Boxi.
Thank you. I think I have a sort of similar locally focused answer, just to be really quick. I'm really interested in how we can capture social value from these investments if this is the path that we're taking, and there's a lot of sort of infrastructural path dependency with things like data center investments. If you look at things like the UK Opportunities Act, which is led by somebody that was a tech investor, a lot of the foreign direct investment that they're encouraging, we're giving subsidies to those companies to build data centers. In the US, there's an organization called Good Jobs First who have published some interesting research about how subsidies are potentially offsetting the revenue benefits of having these data centers being built in local areas. And a question that has come across in my engagements with local government is that they're wondering what the actual benefits are, because it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of jobs. I guess they do need revenue, but they're in this very intense sort of local government austerity position. And these organizations, as Matt mentioned, are not really tied to any sort of social value like other industries are. So I guess it's something around maybe understanding first what local economic benefits are before we move forward into these investments.
Thank you. I'm now very confused about alphabetical order, but we'll go to Matt next.
Thanks. I have a very similar answer, which is about kind of starting with the use cases and what these technologies are actually going to be used for, and then going from there to infrastructural needs. You know, I think to the energy point and the small modular reactors, we'll see if, you know, these fleets promised by Microsoft of SMRs actually materialize. My sense is a lot of it is kind of hype and marketing spin, but I do certainly think it's ludicrous that in certain circles, you know, we talk about as if the next 20, 30 years of UK energy policy should be set by the need to build more and more data centers for highly speculative, unproven technologies. What does that mean practically in terms of starting from use cases? I think we have a lot of technical expertise now in government, particularly in the Air Security Institute, for example, which, you know, does a lot of good work on things like systemic safety, but is by and large, you know, very tethered to this idea of testing the safety or security of frontier models. There's this kind of arms race narrative that many in UK government and in the policy conversation have been kind of captured by, and this obsession with the frontier. And I think actually we need to go back to basics and be looking at testing and validating solutions within the public sector, within local communities, and then thinking about what the research needs are, what the infrastructure needs are, the compute that you need for training and inference, and go from there.
Thank you. You get the last word.
Yeah, thank you. First, let me say that I subscribe to what has been said already. Just wanted to point out that in terms of policies, it's important to remind that the value chain will be only as strong as its weakest link. So that's very important to have this holistic view. And I think in this respect, the example of paragraph that Aleksei mentioned is very useful. 2 points related to paragraph. First, I mean, what they are doing is that they are using a new type of substrate based on carbon to replace some of the materials whose supply is concentrated in a few countries. So it illustrates the need to, you know, develop new alternatives, new technology alternatives that breaks down this concentration problem. And it's also a startup, and I wanted to emphasize this as well. We sometimes see market power in some segments of the value chain. There are many policy levers to alleviate this problem. One is competition policy, but it's not the only one. Business dynamism, the development of new technology is another powerful level to ensure that markets are contestable.
Fantastic, thank you. It's been a really fascinating session. We are now going to stop for an hour for lunch. Folks online as well, we'll be back in an hour. But please join me in thanking our panel.